Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to another story that life itself wrote with its cruel and merciless hand. I'm here in Hua Hin, Thailand, where the warm breeze carries both dreams and nightmares in equal measure. Today, I want to share with you the story of my good friend Robert Mitchell, a man whose heart proved both his greatest strength and his most devastating weakness. We met 3 years ago at a beach party right here on the shores of Hua Hin, both of us expats trying to make sense of our new lives in this beautiful yet dangerous paradise. What I witnessed happen to Robert over the following months changed not just his life, but my understanding of how easily a decent man can fall into the most carefully laid trap. The massage oil glistened on her delicate fingers as she whispered those three words that would destroy everything Robert Mitchell thought he knew about love, trust, and his own judgment. "Marry me, Robert." The words hung in the humid Thai air like incense in a temple, sacred and intoxicating. But what Robert didn't know in that moment, as her hands worked across his weathered skin and her voice painted pictures of their future together, was that he had just heard the opening line of the most expensive performance of his life. A performance that would cost him not just his life savings, but his faith in human connection itself. If you're finding these real-life stories as compelling as I do, please consider subscribing to our channel. Every story we share here comes from real experiences, real pain, and real lessons that we all need to hear. Robert Mitchell was 62 years old when his world first crumbled, and 64 when it crumbled again. The first collapse came with Margaret's cancer diagnosis, delivered on a Tuesday morning in their suburban Toronto kitchen while she was still in her bathrobe, sipping the coffee he had made her every morning for 37 years. The second collapse came 2 years later in a massage parlor in Hua Hin, Thailand, but this time the destroyer wore a different face entirely. He had been a structural engineer his entire career, a man who understood load-bearing walls and foundation integrity, who could calculate exactly how much weight a beam could carry before it snapped. But human hearts, he discovered, followed no engineering principles whatsoever. They could bear impossible loads for decades, then shatter completely under the weight of a single whispered promise. After Margaret's funeral, after the sympathy cards stopped coming and the casseroles from neighbors ran out, Robert found himself staring at walls that had once contained a full life but now felt like a mausoleum. Their daughter lived in Vancouver with her own family, calling dutifully every Sunday, but unable to fill the silence that had settled over his days like dust. The house that had been their sanctuary became a prison of memories, each room echoing with conversations they would never have again. His brother-in-law suggested Thailand. Just for a few months, he said. Get some sun, meet some people, remember what it feels like to be alive. Robert had always been practical, methodical, but grief had made him reckless in ways he didn't yet understand. He sold the house, put most of his belongings in storage, and bought a one-way ticket to Bangkok with the vague notion that maybe, somewhere in the land of smiles, he might find his own smile again. Hua Hin had been a compromise between adventure and safety, exotic enough to feel like escape, but developed enough to feel secure. He rented a small villa near the beach, nothing fancy but clean and quiet, with a view of the Gulf of Thailand that reminded him daily that he was thousands of miles from everything familiar. The routine he developed was simple. Morning walks on the beach, afternoons reading under an umbrella at one of the beachfront restaurants, evenings nursing a beer while watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. It was during one of these sunset rituals that he first saw her. She worked at the massage pavilion that sat like a wooden jewel between the main beach and the hotel strip, her hands already legendary among the expatriate community for their ability to find and release tensions that men didn't even know they were carrying. Pim Chanak was 28 years old, though she looked younger in the golden light that filtered through the pavilion's bamboo screens. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost unfair, with dark eyes that held depths Robert couldn't fathom, and a smile that appeared to be crafted specifically for whoever happened to be looking at her at that moment. But it wasn't just her beauty that drew him. It was the way she seemed to genuinely care about the people who lay on her massage table, the way she asked about their pain and listened to their answers as if their comfort was the most important thing in her world. Robert had always been monogamous by nature and marriage, a man who had never so much as flirted with his secretary or lingered too long looking at other women. But grief, he discovered, had rewired something fundamental in his brain. Margaret was gone, and for the first time in nearly 40 years, he was alone with needs he had forgotten how to meet and desires he had thought were buried with his wife. The first massage was innocent enough, or at least that's what he told himself. His back ached from sleeping on an unfamiliar mattress, and the other expatriates had all recommended Pimchanok's skilled hands. She worked in professional silence at first, finding the knots in his shoulders and back with the precision of someone who had been doing this work for years. But as the weeks passed and he became a regular customer, the silence began to fill with conversation. She asked about his life back home and somehow found herself becoming the first person he had truly talked to about Margaret's death. She listened with an attention that felt almost reverent, asking gentle questions that helped him excavate feelings he had been avoiding. Where other people rushed to fill uncomfortable silences with platitudes about heaven and better places, Pimchanok simply held space for his pain, her hands working steadily while he talked about the woman he had loved and lost. It was during their 7th session together that the boundaries began to blur in ways that Robert wouldn't understand until much later. Her touch lingered longer on his skin, her fingers tracing patterns that had nothing to do with muscle tension and everything to do with something deeper and more dangerous. When she leaned close to whisper instructions about breathing, her lips nearly brushed his ear, and he could smell the faint sweetness of her perfume mixing with the oils on her hands. This is when she first spoke of marriage, though not directly. She talked about loneliness, about how hard it was to find someone who truly understood the weight of caring for others. She mentioned, almost casually, that her previous boyfriend had left her for someone younger, someone who didn't have to work with her hands to support her family back in rural Thailand. The way she told these stories, with Robert lying vulnerable and relaxed under her touch, made him feel like a protector, like someone who could be her salvation just as she was becoming his. The progression from professional massage to something more intimate happened gradually, then all at once. First, her touch became more personal, her hands wandering to places that had nothing to do with therapeutic technique. Then came the longer conversations after the massage was technically finished, the two of them sitting on the pavilion's wooden platform, watching the waves roll in as the sun set behind them. She began to paint pictures of their possible future together with words that seemed to come directly from his own deepest desires. She talked about how nice it would be to take care of someone who appreciated her, to cook for a man who understood that her work was honest and necessary. She spoke of wanting to learn English better so she could travel, maybe visit Canada someday and see the place where he had been happy before. But it was during a massage in their 3rd month of knowing each other that she whispered the words that would change everything. Her hands were working oil into his back, her touch now familiar and comforting in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. The pavilion was empty except for them, the sun setting through the bamboo screens and painting everything in golden light. "Marry me, Robert," she whispered, so softly he almost thought he had imagined it. Her hands never stopped their rhythmic movement as she continued speaking, her voice carrying that musical Thai accent that had become the soundtrack to his healing. "I know you think I'm too young, too different, but I see how lonely you are. I see how good you are. We could take care of each other. Please consider subscribing to our channel and leaving a comment below about whether you or someone you know has ever found yourself in a similar situation where vulnerability was used against you." The proposal, if it could be called that, opened floodgates in Robert's mind and heart that he hadn't even known existed. Here was someone young and beautiful and caring who saw something valuable in his weathered, grief-stricken self. Someone who wanted to build a future with him when he had begun to believe his future held nothing but memories and slow decline. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened in ways that felt both magical and slightly unreal. Pimchanok began staying later at the pavilion when he was her last client of the day, the two of them talking about everything and nothing while her colleagues packed up and went home to their own lives. She started bringing him traditional Thai dishes she had cooked herself, feeding him with her own hands while explaining the significance of each ingredient and technique. She told him about her childhood in a farming village outside of Chiang Mai, about parents who had sacrificed everything to send her to school in Bangkok, about dreams of opening her own business someday but never having the capital to make it happen. She spoke of these dreams with a wistfulness that made Robert want to be the one to make them possible, to be the answer to prayers she was too polite to speak directly. The physical intimacy that developed between them felt like a resurrection for Robert, as if parts of him that had died with Margaret were slowly coming back to life under Pimchanok's patient care. She approached their physical relationship with the same attention and skill she brought to her massage work, seeming to know exactly what he needed and when he needed it. But it was the emotional intimacy that truly captured him. She had a way of making him feel seen and valued that went beyond anything physical. When he talked about his work as an engineer, she listened with genuine fascination, asking intelligent questions about projects he had completed decades ago. When he mentioned missing certain foods from home, she would somehow find ways to recreate them with local ingredients, presenting them with pride in her ability to care for him. Most importantly, she never made him feel guilty about moving on from Margaret. Other people in his life, even his daughter, carried subtle expectations that his grief should be permanent, that loving again would be a betrayal of his deceased wife. But Pimchanok seemed to understand that the capacity to love again was actually a testament to how well he had loved before. It was during their fourth month together that she first mentioned needing money, and she did it so skillfully that Robert almost didn't notice the shift in their dynamic. They were lying together in his villa after an evening that had begun with dinner and wine and progressed naturally to his bedroom, her head on his chest while he played with her long black hair. "My mother is sick," she said quietly, her voice carrying just the right note of worry and vulnerability. "She needs surgery, but we don't have health insurance in my village. I've been trying to save money, but everything I make goes to rent and food and sending a little home to help with her medicine." Robert felt his protective instincts surge immediately. Here was someone who had given him so much comfort and care, and now she needed his help. The amount she mentioned was significant, but not impossible. Enough for a serious surgery, but not so much that it seemed like an obvious con. $25,000 American, she said. Enough to pay for everything and maybe a little extra to help her family while she recovered. He didn't think of it as the beginning of a financial trap. He thought of it as an investment in their future together, a way of proving that his feelings were serious and his commitment real. When he transferred the money to her account the next day, the gratitude in her eyes seemed absolutely genuine. She cried as she thanked him, promising that she would pay him back as soon as possible, that this kindness would never be forgotten. But once the first financial request was met, others followed with increasing frequency. Her visa application to visit Canada required proof of financial support. Her brother's motorcycle accident needed emergency medical care. The roof of her family's house was damaged in a storm and needed immediate repair before the rainy season made it worse. Each request came with detailed explanations, photographs when possible, and promises of repayment that seemed sincere in the moment but somehow never materialized. Robert found himself calculating not just how much he was spending, but how much he was willing to spend to keep this relationship alive. His retirement savings, carefully accumulated over 40 years of steady work, began to evaporate with frightening speed. But it wasn't just the money that created dependency. Pimchanok had become the center of his entire social world in Thailand. She introduced him to her friends, took him to local festivals and markets, helped him navigate the complex social dynamics of being a foreign man in a culture he only partially understood. Without her, he would be completely alone in a country where he spoke almost none of the language and understood even less of the social expectations. More troubling was the way she had become essential to his emotional well-being. She was the first person he spoke to most mornings and the last person he saw most nights. She knew his moods, his fears, his hopes for the future in ways that made him feel simultaneously cared for and exposed. When she was with him, the loneliness that had driven him to Thailand in the first place disappeared completely. When she was away, even for a day or two, it returned with crushing intensity. The psychological dependency was the most insidious of all. Pimchanok had a way of making him feel simultaneously grateful and unworthy, as if her love was a gift he needed to keep earning rather than something freely given. She praised his generosity and kindness while subtly implying that these were the qualities that made him valuable to her. She expressed amazement at his willingness to help her family while making it clear that this help was expected and necessary. She began to manage more and more aspects of his daily life, from helping him navigate conversations with landlords and utility companies to organizing his social calendar and determining which expatriate gatherings he should attend. She did this with such apparent care and competence that he felt grateful rather than controlled. But the effect was to make him increasingly dependent on her judgment and presence. The sexual relationship between them became another form of control, though Robert didn't recognize it as such at the time. Pimchanok was responsive and passionate when things were going well, but whenever he expressed concerns about money or questioned any of her decisions, she would withdraw physically as well as emotionally. She never explicitly connected his financial support to their physical intimacy, but the correlation was impossible to ignore. By their sixth month together, Robert was living a life that revolved entirely around Pimchanok's needs, schedule, and priorities. He had moved to a more expensive villa that she preferred, started eating only at restaurants where she felt comfortable, and begun structuring his days around her work schedule at the massage pavilion. He told himself this was what partnership looked like, that compromise and consideration were the foundations of mature love. But underneath his conscious rationalizations, anxiety was growing like a tumor in his chest. His savings account showed a balance that would have horrified his younger self. Carefully accumulated wealth disappearing at a rate that threatened his ability to maintain his current lifestyle for more than another year or two. When he tried to discuss this with Pimchanok, she would remind him of all the money Western men wasted on cars and gadgets and meaningless luxuries, contrasting his spending on her family's genuine needs with the selfish consumption of his former life. The discovery that shattered everything came not through detective work or confrontation, but through pure accident. Robert had been feeling unwell with what seemed like food poisoning, so Pimchanok had left his villa early to give him space to rest. An hour later, he realized he had left his reading glasses at the massage pavilion and drove over to retrieve them, expecting to find the place locked up for the evening. Instead, he found Pimchanok's colleague, a woman named Siraporn, who had always been friendly but somewhat distant, sitting alone on the pavilion platform smoking a cigarette and staring out at the water. When she saw him, her expression shifted to something that looked like pity mixed with embarrassment. She asked about his stomach troubles in her limited English, and he explained that he was feeling better but had come back for his glasses. As he retrieved them from the small table where clients left their belongings, Siraporn spoke again, her voice careful but determined. "Robert," she said, and something in her tone made him stop and look at her directly. There was a long pause while she seemed to wrestle with herself about whether to continue. Finally, she took a deep breath and said, "You are a good man. You deserve to know truth." What followed was a revelation that reconstructed everything Robert thought he knew about the previous 6 months of his life. Pimchanok was not from a farming village outside of Chiang Mai. She was from Bangkok, the daughter of a middle-class family who ran a successful import business. She had been married twice before, both times to foreign men significantly older than herself. Her mother was not sick. In fact, her parents were currently traveling in Europe on vacation funded by money she had been sending them. Siraporn showed him photographs on her phone that Pimchanok had shared during their lunch breaks. Pictures of luxury handbags and expensive dinners, screenshots of bank transfers to multiple accounts, images of a new car parked outside a modern Bangkok apartment building. But most devastating were the screenshots of conversations between Pimchanok and other women, conversations in Thai that Siraporn translated reluctantly but completely. The conversations revealed a network of women working similar schemes, sharing strategies, and comparing earnings like salespeople discussing quarterly results. Pimchanok had been coached on exactly what to say to widowed Western men, how to time requests for money, how to create emotional dependency that would keep the funds flowing even when logical doubts began to surface. In one message thread, she described Robert as her current project, discussing his emotional vulnerabilities and financial capacity with clinical detachment. She referred to him using a Thai phrase that Siraporn reluctantly translated as broken bird, a term apparently used to describe grieving older men who were particularly susceptible to manipulation. Most crushing of all were the messages where Pimchanok mocked Robert's emotional attachment to her, sharing screenshots of his romantic text messages with friends who responded with laughing emojis and comments about how easy foreign men were to manipulate. She had screenshot intimate conversations where he had opened his heart about missing his deceased wife, sharing them for entertainment with people who saw his grief as weakness to be exploited. Siraporn explained that she had been watching this pattern for months, growing increasingly uncomfortable with what she witnessed, but unsure whether it was her place to interfere. What finally motivated her to speak was overhearing Pimchanok on a phone call that afternoon, discussing plans to disappear within the next few weeks, taking one final large sum from Robert before cutting off all contact and moving on to her next target. The confrontation, when Robert finally worked up the courage to have it, took place 2 days later at his villa. He had spent the intervening time in a state of shock and denial, alternately convincing himself that Siraporn was lying or mistaken, then forcing himself to review every interaction with Pimchanok through the lens of this new information. When she arrived that evening for what had become their routine dinner date, Robert was waiting with printed screenshots of the conversations Siraporn had shown him, translated into English by another expatriate friend who spoke fluent Thai. He had rehearsed the conversation multiple times, planning to be calm and direct, to give her a chance to explain or apologize. Instead, when confronted with undeniable evidence, Pimchanok transformed into someone Robert had never seen before. The gentle, caring woman he had fallen in love with disappeared, replaced by someone cold and calculating who seemed genuinely annoyed that her carefully laid plans had been disrupted. She didn't deny the conversations or the lies about her background. Instead, she attacked him for violating her privacy and questioned what right he had to judge how she earned money from foolish foreign men who were too lonely and desperate to think clearly. She pointed out that he had received value for his money in the form of companionship and physical intimacy, framing their entire relationship as a business transaction he had been too naive to understand. When he tried to appeal to what he thought they had shared together, she laughed with genuine amusement at his emotional attachment. She told him that Western men always confused paid attention with real love, that his need to be needed had made him an easy target from the moment she first saw him sitting alone at that beachfront restaurant. But it was when he asked about the money, about the possibility of any repayment, that the conversation turned truly vicious. Pimchanok told him that he should be grateful for the education he had received, that learning not to be such an easy victim was worth whatever he had paid for the lesson. She suggested that his deceased wife would be ashamed of how easily he had dishonored her memory by falling for such an obvious scam. The financial manipulation didn't end with the confrontation. Over the following weeks, as Robert tried to extract himself from the relationship, Pimchanok employed increasingly sophisticated forms of pressure to maintain access to his money. She alternated between apparent remorse and vicious attacks on his character, sometimes within the same conversation. She claimed that their relationship had been real for her too, that she had genuinely developed feelings that made her want to change her ways, but that his lack of trust and his invasion of her privacy had destroyed any chance of authentic connection between them. She suggested that if he could find it in his heart to forgive her and trust her again, she would be willing to start over on more honest terms. When emotional manipulation proved insufficient, she moved to more direct forms of coercion. She reminded him that he was in Thailand on a tourist visa, that his legal status was precarious and dependent on the goodwill of local authorities who might not look kindly on foreign men who took advantage of young Thai women. She implied connections to police and immigration officials that could make his life very difficult if he didn't continue to be generous with his financial support. Most effective was her threat to contact his daughter in Vancouver, to share intimate photographs and messages that would reveal the full extent of his relationship with her. She had been careful to document their physical intimacy, she revealed, creating an insurance policy that she could use if he ever became uncooperative. The thought of his daughter learning about this relationship, particularly the sexual aspects, was more terrifying to Robert than the loss of his remaining money. For several weeks, he continued making payments while trying to figure out how to escape the situation without destroying his relationship with his family or facing legal consequences in a foreign country. The stress began to affect his physical health, causing insomnia and anxiety attacks that made him feel like he was losing his mind as well as his money. The solution, when it came, required Robert to find courage he didn't know he still possessed and to accept help from people he barely knew. The expatriate community in Hua Hin, he discovered, included several men who had faced similar situations and others who worked with local authorities to help foreign residents navigate complex legal and social problems. Through careful planning and local support, Robert managed to extricate himself from Pimchanok's influence without legal consequences or family embarrassment. The process required him to accept that most of his money was gone forever and that his dream of starting over in Thailand was probably over as well. But more than that, it required him to confront the ways his own vulnerability and loneliness had made him complicit in his own victimization. He had to accept that his desperate need to be needed again had overridden his normally careful judgment, that his fear of being alone had made him willing to ignore warning signs that should have been obvious. The escape from immediate danger was just the beginning of Robert's real recovery work. Returning to Canada with his finances decimated and his confidence shattered, he found himself facing not just practical challenges but deep psychological wounds that would take years to heal. The practical problems were serious enough. His retirement savings, reduced by more than 60%, would require him to dramatically downsize his lifestyle and possibly return to work part-time to maintain basic security. The house he had sold before leaving for Thailand had increased in value beyond his current ability to repurchase, meaning he would need to find rental housing and abandon his dream of aging in place in familiar surroundings. But the emotional wounds cut deeper than the financial ones. Robert found himself unable to trust his own judgment about people, second-guessing every social interaction and wondering what hidden motivations might be driving others' apparent kindness toward him. The loneliness that had driven him to Thailand in the first place was now compounded by shame and self-doubt that made reaching out for genuine connection feel impossible. He began working with a therapist who specialized in helping victims of financial and romantic fraud, learning that his experience was part of a much larger pattern of exploitation that targeted vulnerable people across all demographics and cultures. The therapy helped him understand that his victimization didn't reflect fundamental flaws in his character, but rather the intersection of normal human needs with sophisticated predatory behavior. Through support groups, he met other people who had survived similar experiences, learning that recovery was possible but required patience, self-compassion, and willingness to slowly rebuild trust in both others and himself. He discovered that his experience, while devastating, had also taught him things about resilience and human nature that would ultimately make him stronger and wiser. The process of healing forced Robert to examine aspects of his marriage and his grief that he had been avoiding. He came to understand that his idealization of his relationship with Margaret had left him unprepared for the complexities of forming new attachments later in life. He learned that his fear of dishonoring her memory had actually made him more vulnerable to manipulation, as he had been desperate to prove that his capacity for love was still intact. Working through his grief in a healthier way allowed him to separate his genuine desire for companionship from his need to validate his own worth through another person's attention. He began to understand the difference between loneliness and solitude, learning to find peace in his own company while remaining open to authentic connection when it appeared. As Robert's story comes to a close, I want you to understand that recovery from this kind of betrayal is possible, though it requires time, support, and tremendous courage. Robert today is a different man than the one who first arrived in Thailand seeking to escape his grief. He's more cautious but also more self-aware, more careful about trusting others, but also more compassionate toward himself. He returned to work part-time as a consulting engineer, finding meaning and purpose in helping solve complex structural problems for clients who valued his expertise. He began volunteering with organizations that help seniors avoid financial fraud, turning his painful experience into a way of protecting others from similar exploitation. Most importantly, he learned that healing from profound loss, whether through death or betrayal, requires accepting that we cannot control how others behave toward us, but we can control how we respond to that behavior. He discovered that resilience is not about avoiding further pain, but about learning to move through pain without being destroyed by it. His relationship with his daughter, initially strained by his decision to pursue a new life in Thailand, ultimately grew stronger through his willingness to be honest about his mistakes and his commitment to rebuilding his life with integrity. She came to respect his courage in facing his vulnerabilities and working to overcome them, rather than simply retreating into bitterness or cynicism. Robert's story reminds us that predators exist in every culture and every context, but so do good people willing to offer genuine help when we're ready to accept it. It shows us that our deepest vulnerabilities can become our greatest strengths once we learn to acknowledge them without shame. To anyone watching who has found themselves in a similar situation, know that your worth as a person is not determined by someone else's decision to exploit your trust. Your capacity for love and connection is not diminished by having that capacity manipulated by someone who saw it as weakness rather than strength. The journey back to trusting yourself and others is long and sometimes painful, but it is absolutely possible. Seek support from professionals who understand these dynamics, connect with others who have survived similar experiences, and be patient with yourself as you rebuild. Your story is not defined by how you were victimized, but by how you choose to heal and move forward. If you found Robert's story meaningful, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment sharing your thoughts or experiences. We'll continue bringing you real stories about real people facing life's most challenging moments, because it's through sharing these experiences that we help each other find the strength to heal and grow. Remember that you are not alone, and that recovery is always possible for those willing to do the difficult work of rebuilding their lives with wisdom earned through pain.